we've covered the basic aspects of iconography as a visual language. Its vocabulary and its grammar. The little iconographic devices that make up the words, and how you put those words together in icon types or different types of depiction. But now we have to explore some of the theoretical aspects of the icon, and that's really important to understanding how icons communicate and how we can learn their language. The most basic aspect of iconographic theory, I would say, is a theory of depiction itself. How do icons relate to that which they're depicting? How do they go about theoretically depicting objects? And in art, there's really a spectrum of possibilities of depiction. On the one hand, you have sort of realism, where you're trying to recreate or represent as closely as possible what you're depicting. And then the other side of this spectrum is pure abstraction, to where it doesn't even need to be intelligible, that this has any relation to the object itself. And that's a very wide spectrum. Icons tend to sort of hover in the middle, but closer towards realism. To add more to our spectrum here, we have realism. We can also have naturalism, which is referencing real, natural objects, people, places, events, what have you, but not in a photographic, realistic kind of way. So we have naturalism. Then we have stylization. Stylization is when you're also referencing natural objects, but in a stylized way, where form and pattern and color become more important, but they're still intelligible. They're still recognized. They have a recognizable relationship to the object. Icons don't go into pure abstraction. If they do, it's on things that don't matter, like the landscape or things like that, or at least don't matter to the language of icons, and we'll get to why that's the case in a second. But that's our spectrum, and as I said, icons tend to hover around naturalism to stylization. One of the misconceptions that you'll often come across is that icon painting, its lack of realism, comes out of a loss of technical skill. And hopefully throughout the course of these lectures, you've realized that is just simply not the case. Icon painting, particularly in that early stage, has very naturalistic, bordering on a realistic depictions. And at certain stages, it moved to more of a stylization. And certain stages, it went back to more of a naturalization. So it tends to shift, but it's not because artistic talent is lacking. It's because what the icon is trying to do changes, and icons never really venture all the way into that complete realism. And the ancients were well aware of that realism. There's a famous story of one of the ancient Greek painters who painted a scene of fruit, so perfectly that birds would come and peck at it, thinking that they were going to, eat the grapes. So ultra realism or hyper realism or illusionistic painting was well known in the ancient world, but they intentionally moved away from it to explore other possibilities, other ways of communicating. Now, photographers are very much aware that there is a lot of artistry that goes into even something as exact duplication as a photograph. I mean, photographers just don't snap a picture. They are artists in their own right. Because there's decisions being made in how to go about even depicting something naturalistically. And what happens in painting is those decisions predominate, because you have complete control over how to relate to the realism of your subject. So that's just something that we throw out there. Icons are not attempting to be photographically realistic, because they're not locked into history, and we'll actually get to that just in a little bit. So in icons, we don't have things that you would be present in a hyper-realistic depiction. So we don't have a strong light source, an external light source. Sometimes you see a fairly strong light source in icon painting, coming from one side, or my window's right here, coming from one side to where one side's brighter and going into shadow. Icon painting sometimes has no reference to external light source. So it does reference an object, and an object, to be able to see it, has to be illumined, because that's how vision works. It needs light in order to function. So light source is certainly not absent in an icon, but it's not focused on in a way to fool the eye, as if you're looking into a scene, so to speak. Another thing that you don't necessarily see in icons are things like foreshortening, or even oftentimes shadows are not present in icons. And it's not because, again, the ancients didn't know about these conventions. They certainly knew about them, and in ancient Roman art they used them. But the icon is moving away from them, because what it's trying to communicate is not a reality that's locked into a specific historical moment. So we do see a movement away from realism, but it has a purpose. They're moving away from realism in icons for the sake of the clarity of what the icon's trying to communicate. Another aspect of the iconographic style's relationship to the object is how the icons depict the human form. There is a certain measure of realism. St. Paul is depicted bald. There's stereotypical aspects of different personalities that certainly are in the icon, but the icons are always slightly idealized. Part of what the icon's depicting is the human person, the human being, the historical figure, but it's really the historical figure as they're taken up into the fullness of redemption. So there is part of that means there is an aspect of idealization, to where this is the ideal form of this human person, but another aspect of that is you won't find in icons any reference to physical ailments or injuries or diseases, unless there's a martyrdom scene. Typically, we don't depict anything with excessive gore, because really, again, this is not a historical photograph. We understand, in a scene like the crucifixion, that this is incredibly painful and bloody, but you don't necessarily see that in the icon, because, again, the icon isn't locked into that historical moment. It's seeing the scene from an eternal perspective, from a post-resurrection light, and that's idealizing and redeeming the forms in the icon. So that can sometimes strike especially people more exposed to Western Christian art, as a little different, that we don't sort of focus on that gritty realism. And again, it's not because we can't, it's because the icon isn't theoretically coming from that disposition. Its vantage point is beyond and above that. It's not seeking to investigate the scene from that very limited snapshot of the part, of the glimpse. It wants to see the whole. It's historia within theoria. So even though icons are not trying to be photographic, they do recognize that they're depicting individuals. So yes, the figures are slightly elongated as far as body proportions. Yes, the figures are somewhat idealized, but they are referencing real flesh and blood human beings, and that does, to an extent, take into account their historical reality. Just some debates or things that iconographers talk about where icon theory sometimes gets hard to flesh out is, what do you do with modern saints that we have photographs of, where we can depict them in a very particularized way, but that is something of a departure from the iconographic tradition? When I see icons that are too close to photographs, they don't strike me as iconographic. There's also funny situations where, let's say, this saint was a little more corpulent, more plump than a healthy, realized human being ought to be. How do you depict them in heavenly glory? Let's say the saint was like me, who was nearsighted. Do you depict them with glasses? Do they wear glasses in heaven? Does Christ redeem their eyes to where they no longer need glasses? So we do have interesting aspects of this idealization, this fully redeemed depiction, when it comes to saints that we're very familiar with photographic depictions of them. So there are certain things in modernity that get a little interesting. But we are referencing real flesh and blood human beings. So sometimes icons, the question is asked, what about ethnicity, or what we call phenotype in an icon? The rule of thumb is we depict the phenotype, or the ethnic or genetic expressions of certain ethnicities and races. We do depict those in icons, and that's always been the tradition. The Ethiopian eunuch in the icons that St. Philip, I believe, discusses or encounters in the book of Acts is always an Ethiopian. He's black skinned. So is St. Moses, the Ethiopian, the desert father. So we depict these people in their historical reality, but also it's in an idealized form. We do run into situations where those ethnicities were not well known. So a lot of times in Russian icon painting, the ethnic depictions are kind of all flattened out. But at least in the Greek tradition, where knowledge of the rest of the world was much more ready at hand, those ethno phenotypes are present in icons, even to the point where the Goths are very. When we have Gothic martyr saints, they're blonde-haired, blue-eyed Europeans, and when we have Ethiopians, they're black-skinned Africans, because that's what these people, historically were. So we do have ethnophenotype in icons, but a lot of scholars, when they talk about the sacred figures in biblical scenes, they actually use an expression called the Greco-Semitic Ideal. So the depiction there is really a cross between the Greek ideal and the Semitic ideal. So oftentimes you'll hear, Christ's ethnophenotype in icons refer to that as the Greco-Semitic ideal. I actually got into a debate, not a debate, but a conversation with a gentleman one time when I was giving a talk, and he asked about the icons. Well, how come they don't look like normal people? And I showed him lots of examples of late Byzantine art where there was that naturalism, where they do look, more naturalistic. And he's like, well, but this painting looks more like real people. And he pointed to, a Dutch oil painting of the Mother of God. And I went, well, no, that looks like people, that you're used to encountering with, Northern Europeans. I go to an Arab church, so the people in the icons look like the people I go to church with. So there is this ethnophenotype that does affect art, but it doesn't need to be a contentious element. The rule of thumb is we are referencing real historical figures, and we don't like to depart from that. There are instances, again, where certain iconographic traditions are in isolation, where it's not readily intelligible of what other people in the world look like. So we see that in Ethiopian icons, everyone looks like an Ethiopian because they were isolated. In some Northern European art, everyone looks like a Northern European, and in some Chinese and Japanese Christian art, everyone looks Asian. That's really the byproduct of isolation. So the rule of thumb in the iconographic tradition is we're referencing their historical reality, but their historical reality redeemed in the fullness of Christ. And when you go to heaven and your body is raised from the dead, this is not a doctrinal position, but my understanding is that it is really you and your historical reality, the givenness of your being, where you come from, who your parents are. All of that is a part of you. So we try to maintain that in the iconographic tradition without getting really into sort of that photorealism. Another aspect that I've already kind of mentioned is how do icons interact with time. And again, they're not trying to be locked into time. And one way to think of it is, when a religious depiction gets too locked into being photographic, it really is limited to just that scene. I'm always struck every year after it, in the Paschal season, there's one Sunday, and I don't quite know what I have to go investigate this, but we read the Passion again. But it's the Passion in the light of the resurrection. It doesn't have the same sense that it did on the great orthros of the Passion, where we read all the Passion Gospels. There's something different about it. It's the Passion infused with the light of the resurrection, and that's how I like to think of our relationship in iconography with history. It is history. We're referencing historical events, but it's again history in the fullness of eternity, in the fullness of salvation history. So pictures take place within time, but they're not locked into time. And we see that actually in how icons treat historical realities. So oftentimes in icons, if there's multiple scenes back to back, we'll just depict them back to back. You'll have Christ here and Christ here and Christ here, where we have no qualms about squishing in multiple historical realities into one composition, just referencing them through another device, like maybe this chronologically scene will take here or over here, but they're all within the same picture space. That's a very, very common convention that we shouldn't have too many qualms about. Another thing you'll notice in icons is they have this they're chronologically leaky. Sometimes scenes in the past, you'll get later saints will show up in them. We don't really respect sometimes chronology. A very important example is oftentimes St. Paul will sneak into depictions of the apostles. Because he was an apostle, he was, in his own estimation, untimely born. He was the least of the apostles, the last of them. He never saw Christ in, pre-resurrection. But we will sneak him in sometimes. So icons can play with chronology because really what we're referencing is the fullness of time, not necessarily trying to lock the icon into a historical context. So we'll sneak bishops in from later, or saints, or use chronological juxtapositions. So a lot of times in like Old Testament scenes, we'll sneak the New Testament fulfillments into them. I'm thinking of the famous icon of the burning bush. You'll have St. John of Damascus there meditating on the scene. So icons can be very flexible chronologically. So again, they're not trying to reference that historical moment in and of itself or in isolation. Another theoretical aspect of the icon that does influence iconographic depiction is how we reference space. And this is something actually much has been written about. We can't go too much into it, but the question is, do icons have a theory of representing perspective? And if you don't know, one of the major breakthroughs within sort of the Western painting tradition and the Italian Renaissance is a system of accurately depicting what's called a vanishing point. So using math and lines to really depict particularly buildings as they actually appear to the eye, as they're getting further back, they're getting smaller, and eventually going to that vanishing point on the horizon line. So there's a whole system of perspective, of 1 point, 2 point perspective is another system that Western art has, and that is not present in the icon. Scholars are out debate whether the ancients knew of linear perspective or not. Some paintings do show linear perspective in the ancient Roman world, but it doesn't seem like people focused on it, and it doesn't have the same mathematical precision as later, Renaissance paintings would have. So my instinct is that they didn't use a linear perspective system, but in icons we find that just not present at all. There is no attempt to represent the figures in real space. Every once in a while there's a shadow, which was known in antiquity, but in icons it doesn't really show up, again because we don't have strong light sources. That might be why shadows don't show up. But there's no instinct to depict naturalistic landscaping or setting. What's contentious is there are people who believe that there is an iconographic theory of perception called inverse perspective, where instead of the lines coming to a vanishing point out, in the distance, the vanishing point is actually the viewer. And when you map out the different lines and icons in the buildings, that may seem to be possible, but it also just might people overthinking it a little bit. So I'll let you decide. You can look into inverse perspective. But what I think is actually going on is in iconography, there's this desire to depict everything in full clarity. We don't use a lot of the profile view. We don't use foreshortening of the figures so much, because we want to show as much as we can as clearly as possible. Again, the theoretical raison d'etre of the icon is to communicate. So we want to show everything as best we can, as clearly as we can. And sometimes with buildings, that means showing 3 different sides at once. It's not cubism, it's not abstraction, it may not even be inverse perspective, but it is a desire to show as much as we can in the icon. So you'll notice that, particularly with buildings. Another thing you'll notice with icons is that the natural space is usually very stereotypical. Some mountains, hills, maybe some grass, but we don't spend a lot of time on showing different, typographies. I had a student one time who traveled to Greece, and she called me on the phone all excited and going, "Oh, I never realized this is why we paint the mountains this way, because that's what they look like in Greece." And she was visiting the famous rock monasteries of Meteoria, and she said, a lot of the iconographic depictions with these craggy rocks are really what you do see in Greece, which is predominantly ocean and craggy mountainous regions. So that is part of the iconographic style, and we don't try to incorporate many other typographies other than that, mostly to keep the communication of the sacred scenes clear. We don't want to distract, and we don't want the emphasis to shift on the natural depiction of space that isn't necessarily related to the salvation history. So when bodies of water are part of what's being depicted, there certainly will be depicted, but again, not in a photograph or a photorealistic kind of way. Another interesting things you will note in icons is that we don't depict interior space. Again, that would be a confinement. We never confine icons. They're always open to eternity, open to spiritual reality. So we don't see interior space, but interior space is referenced. And if you look in icons, you will oftentimes see a red curtain that is draped in some of the architectural features. And that actually is an iconographic device that goes all the way back to ancient Greek theater. So in ancient Greek theater, you would have one, set of stage props, and how they would tell the audience whether this was taking place, the scene was taking place inside or outside, would drape a cloth on some of the set props. And that convention found its way into icon painting. A lot of times you'll see or hear or read different interpretations. The cloth symbolizes the Holy Spirit, and that's a beautiful interpretation. I don't dispute that, but it doesn't always work, and we know for a fact that was a theatrical convention. And invariably, in an icon, when you see an interior space or a scene that's taking place in interior space, you'll have that cloth. So that's just an iconographic device that it's good to know, because now you know how to read that as an interior scene rather than an exterior scene. So that covers the basic, and just the basic overview of iconographic theory, how it relates to depiction, how it depicts the human form, how it relates to time, and how it relates to space. And what I would highlight out of this very brief, very introductory presentation of iconographic theory is, again, the icon doesn't get locked into this sort of photographic historicity. And I've been using throughout these lectures an analogy to biblical interpretation of historia and theoria. And really, icons are going after the theoria. That doesn't negate the historia. It's not just about these lofty theological realities, but it is theology. Oftentimes you'll hear people even call icon painting icon writing because it's theology in color. For a variety of reasons, I find that abusive to the English language, so I don't use that terminology. But the idea, we have to affirm that icons are speaking of the Christian mysteries in a theological fullness. In the Western interpretation of Scripture, there's this wonderful phrase, the sensus plenior, the full sense of an interpretation, which involves the historical, but there's other elements that are on top of that and contextualizing that. This history contextualized within a larger history, contextualized within a spiritual reality, contextualized within an analogical, or where is this leading in the fullness of salvation history, contextualized in an eternal perspective. And that's how we approach the part. We approach the part within the fullness of the whole. And that's our theological understanding, and that's the theory behind how icons are depicting these sacred scenes, these sacred events. So we do interesting things with time and space, not for the sake of abstraction, not for the sake of, existential, kind of realities, impressionism, or what have you, some of these different currents of modern art. It's really rooted in a theological instinct that the paintings are depicting the theological fullness of these sacred figures and sacred scenes.